Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us and for sharing this virtual space. My name is Sierra Kaler-Jones, and I'm the Executive Director of Rethinking Schools. And I'm so thrilled to welcome you for this important conversation. Today's conversation is being co-hosted by the Debt Collective and Rethinking Schools. The Debt Collective is a debtors union fighting to cancel debts and build a world where education is free and publicly funded, healthcare is universal, and housing is guaranteed for all. Rethinking Schools is a nonprofit publisher and advocacy organization dedicated to sustaining and strengthening public education through social justice teaching and education activism. Our magazine, books, and other resources promote equity and racial justice in the classroom. I am joined by two colleagues and friends as co-moderators. Please join me in welcoming Adam Sanchez and Jason Wozniak. Adam is the interim managing editor of Rethinking Schools, and Jason Wozniak is an assistant professor in the Educational Foundations and Policy Studies Department at Westchester University, Pennsylvania. He is a political education organizer with the Debt Collective and Pennsylvania Debt Collective branch leader. Today, you'll hear from the authors of several articles of our special summer issue. This discussion will examine the shaky foundations of US school funding and the growing monster of school debt on top of it, the impact of teacher debt, activism to abolish student lunch debt, and how to and how not to teach about the debt economy. And we are launching our special summer issue called Resisting Debt, Funding Justice, which was guest edited by Jason Wozniak and Eleni Shermer, who you'll hear from today. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation, especially since I just got an email about my student loan payments restarting. So this conversation is so necessary, and I'm looking forward to diving in. So Adam, I'll pass it over to you to make an exciting announcement.
Yes, and I should just say, if it's a little choppy, or if some of us go out on the East Coast here, there is a monster storm coming through, and a number of us are in Philly and DC, and so that is probably going to account for it. I think some of us already lost power. So let me just, I just want to come in. Jason and I have two quick pitches for you. And we'll probably reiterate them at the end. But I just want to make a huge pitch. This issue is so incredible. And Rethinking Schools is on the front lines of both kind of helping educators theorize what is going on in this moment, what is going on with the economy, how does it relate to schools, how does debt play a role in that, and fighting back. And in fact, one of the things we're hoping to do is organize a panel in September of folks who have been on the front lines of fighting back against these critical race theory bans, the kind of anti-LGBTQ backlash that has been going on in our schools. And so and to do that, we can't, I'll just be honest, right? Like, that backlash has had an effect. It has had an effect on Rethinking Schools. It has had an effect on the whole publishing industry, the left publishing industry. And so I am just making a pitch to you all. If you do not already have a subscription to Rethinking Schools, especially if you're a first-time subscriber, we have a gift subscription today, not a gift, a regular subscription today. We've got a discount code for it for $18, resist debt. You put in that discount code and you can get a subscription to the magazine. And I also just want to say, if you are interested in becoming a regular sustainer of this work, which I think is so crucial to the the work in Rethinking Schools, I think for me as a decade-long teacher was crucial. So if you're interested in becoming a sustainer, you can go to the donate page, and like as little as $5 a month gets you a subscription to the magazine, and you know that you are sustaining this work. So I want to really encourage folks to take the time to do that. If you like what you're hearing today, if you want to help sustain this crucial work to fight against this backlash and help us theorize what is going on in our schools. I'm going to pass it over to Jason, who's going to tell you about another exciting opportunity with the Debt Collective.
All right. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Sierra. Thank you, everyone from Rethinking Schools. This is a huge honor to be here in this presence with you all. You're leading the charge in so many directions. And I just want to say to all the people that are on this call, this is one of the first steps to debt liberation, debt abolition, debt resistance. And what do I mean by that? It's that like debtors need to gather together to have power. Because one of the things that debt does is it drives us apart. But when we come together to talk about debt, we do what those that indebt us don't want us to do. They don't want us to talk to each other. They don't want us to be in the same room. They don't want us to be communicating about what it takes to abolish all the unjust debts that teachers, educators across the country have. So I want to say thank you so much for just being here, because that's a first step. The other thing I want to say is that, as Adam mentioned, Debt Collective, we've been in this battle for over 10 years. We started in Occupy Wall Street. We turned ourselves into a tight, compact fighting force, and we wouldn't be anywhere near where we are today in the debt abolition conversation without the work of this activist group. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what we do. We resist a variety of types of debt: student debt, housing debt, carceral prison debt, medical debt, you name it, because ultimately what we're trying to point out and get to is the way in which capitalism indebts all workers and imposes work on all of us and takes away our free time that we should be using for other things like being with our families, being with our students, and otherwise. So you have a chance to join us, Debt Collective. We are, as of today, forming a special educator debtor caucus at debtcollective.org. I think someone can put that in the chat, but if you go on and you sign up for Debt Collective, there's a button you can press that says, if you're an educator or not. And what that means, being in the caucus, is that you will be given a quarterly newsletter talking about debt and the way it impacts teachers. We'll have meetings across the country. We're going to have one in New York at a bar and community center. We're going to have one in Philly. We're going to have one in Los Angeles, a bunch of other places. And then we'll also do stuff online where educators that are in debt can come together and talk. So please check out debtcollective.org. Sign up to be part of the struggle. Every bit helps. And I look forward to this event tonight. Thank you.
Awesome. So we're gonna introduce our panelists, and I'm super excited to have this group of folks here. So our panelists represent a variety of folks and authors of pieces in this summer issue who are going to be speaking on a whole bunch of different issues related to debt, resisting debt, and our schools. So I'm going to start with introducing a few. So Stan Karp is a Rethinking Schools editor and a policy advocate for New Jersey's Education Law Center. He was a high school teacher in Paterson, New Jersey for 30 years. Eleni Shermer is a writer, educator, and organizer currently living in Montreal. She works as a postdoc at Concordia University's Social Justice Center. And Elizabeth Lester Abdallah is a founding member of the Pennsylvania Cancel Lunch Debt Coalition.
Next, I'd like to introduce Nick Marcial as a founding member of the Pennsylvania Cancel Lunch Debt Coalition and an organizer and branch leader with Debt Collective and the Pennsylvania branch. Frida Anderson is a loving partner and parent. Frida has been teaching history and activism at public high schools for the last 7 years. And Hyung Nam is a social studies teacher at Ida B. Wells Barnett High School in Portland, Oregon.
I get to introduce Rochelle, and Rochelle Brooks is a mama, an educator, organizer with Debt Collective, and the founder of Rethink It, an organization dedicated to providing resources to mitigate the harm of systemic racism. And I think that's it, right? All right. Oh, Brian Gallagher, sorry. Hold on, sorry. Brian Gallagher is a teacher organizer in Philadelphia. happens to be, in my view, one of the best organizers in the city, brings together all sorts of people from all age groups. And it's a huge honor to be here with Brian as well. So thank you, Brian. Sorry, my friend.
All right. So we're gonna break this up into 3 different sections, and I'm gonna take the first section, which in some ways is a heavy section. It asks us to really think through some of the big things going on in our school. And then we're going to hear from some of the folks kind of taking on one of the sharpest points in debt resisting in our schools. So I want to start, I want to turn to Stan Karp. You know, Stan has this brilliant piece in the summer issue that I think is just like so essential for everyone to read to understand how messed up education funding in this country is, honestly. So Stan, you know, both in your work for Rethinking Schools and for Education Law Center, you've analyzed deeply the ways that schools are funded in this country. So I want to ask you if you can give us a snapshot of what this looks like. How are schools funded in the United States? How does this differ from elsewhere? And what are some of the efforts underway to transform the way that we fund our schools? Real simple question.
Yeah, right, simple. In a few minutes. Thanks, Adam. It's great to be here. You know, the details of school funding are really complicated, but the heart of the matter is simple. Most schools don't get enough money to provide all their students with a high quality education. And the money they do get is not distributed fairly. As a matter of fact, one of the main annual surveys of school funding systems says that unequal opportunity is a universal feature of school funding systems. And to try to remake this system, it really begins, you have to start with trying to understand how the system reproduces inequality instead of eliminating it. And one of the big ways in which this happens, which many people are not really familiar with, I know during my many years as a high school teacher, I would begin these conversations with, where does the right to a free public education come from? And invariably, someone will say the Constitution, and most people don't realize that education is not a fundamental right that's guaranteed by the US Constitution or supported by the federal Treasury. And it really makes the United States an outlier. The United Nations recognizes about 200 countries in the world. About 195 of them give the right, mention the right to an education in their founding documents. But the US is not one of them. And the reason that there is no federal right to education really traces the country's historic fault lines going back to the Civil War. Before the Civil War, it was illegal for Black people to even aspire to something like literacy. There was no public education. And it was often one of the first efforts to form public education came during that period, during the Civil War, that short period of Reconstruction, when multiracial legislatures in the South set up public schools, and when radical Republicans in Congress even demanded as a condition, some of the, excuse me, I'm losing my pods here, sorry, demanded that as a condition of readmission to the Union, that some of the Southern states had to add to their state constitutions a clause guaranteeing universal access to public education. But as we know, Reconstruction was a short period that was defeated, and it was replaced by a period of Jim Crow, Plessy versus Ferguson, separate versus equal, when, you know, states' rights and local control of schools became integral parts of segregation and apartheid schooling in the United States. And even when came around to Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, that ended legal segregation in a way, but within 20 years, the federal government through the Supreme Court issued another decision that is actually being, we're marking the 50th anniversary of it this year, a decision called San Antonio versus Rodriguez, which said that education was not a fundamental right guaranteed by the US Constitution. And that decision, which was a 5-4 decision in 1973, closed the federal treasury to advocates like Demetrius Rodriguez, who's the parent from San Antonio who had 3 kids in San Antonio schools that he felt were not getting the same levels of education as they were in other parts of Texas. And so they sued the state of Texas in the federal court. It went up to the Supreme Court. And in fact, the Supreme Court ruled that education was not a federal right that the federal government had to honor or support. And one of the interesting things, if you're interested more in that decision, and you can go and take a look at the article in Rethinking Schools Debt Issue, because it describes how the same kind of racial inequality that was reflected in the Jim Crow era of schooling, actually, even in the 20 years between Brown versus Board of Education and San Antonio and Rodriguez, had a huge impact on the court. And the court itself, the justices of the court, decided that the federal commitment to education that Brown seemed to represent was not something that they were prepared to take up and support. And so because of that, school funding is not a federal issue. It became an issue in 50 different states, which have very patchwork system of very unequal and inadequate funding systems that deliver very different experiences to kids in different communities, different racial groups, and across different classes. And for 50 years, advocates have battled these state systems. Since 1973, there have been state funding cases in 48 of the 50 states. About half of those have ended with some kind of remedy or reform of the funding system, and about half of them have just gotten shut down with no changes, or where the court's saying, well, it's really up to the legislature, we don't have any authority. There are basically 2 kinds of cases. There are adequacy cases, equity cases, which really focus on unequal per pupil spending levels across different districts. And there are adequacy cases, which really focus on the gap between what schools receive from the funding system and what state and federal standards ask them to do. The most recent funding case that I know many of the panelists tonight are familiar with was in Pennsylvania. And one of the things that was documented during that case was a $4.6 billion gap between what schools received and what the state's own cost studies said was necessary to help kids graduate, make it all the way through high school, pass the tests, and get the kind of supports they need. And so decades of litigation have established that it's the state rather than the local district. These districts are creatures of the state, but it's the state rather than the federal government or the district that is really responsible for equal funding. And that's why it has been the target of a lot of the school funding systems, school funding cases. Some of these have been extremely successful. I taught in a district in Paterson, New Jersey, that was the benefit of a case called Abbott that produced really dramatic gains. It produced full day pre-K for 3- and 4-year-olds. It produced class size limits of 15 through the 3rd grade. It increased levels of spending, and it required the state to spend 100% of facilities requirements. It was a tremendous decision for the kids in Paterson and for my school, but it only covered 30 of the 600 districts in New Jersey, and it's been steadily eroded ever since those gains were coming. So one of the things, and I want to leave this because I know we have a lot to cover tonight, but one of the things that has been characteristic of the most successful school funding cases has been that it hasn't just been a legal case, that it's been combined with broad grassroots advocacy efforts, coalitions for fair funding that not only support the legal struggles, but actually mobilize broader and broader constituencies of students and parents and teachers, and make those students and teachers and parents the face of the court suits. And one of the things that's exciting about what we're doing tonight is, in order to do this in the future, these cases are not only going to have to find new strategies, they're going to have to find new vision. They're going to have to find ways not just to advocate for funding that's going to help kids meet state standards, but advocate for funding that is actually going to support what the students have already learned about themselves and their cultures and their communities, and support them with not just remedial kinds of programs, but much broader visions of what schools can be in a multicultural democratic society. And so one of the things that we're here tonight to learn is from the Debt Collective and other people who have used great strategies to bring people together to talk about how does unequal school funding, impact people every day. What are the ways in which schools can be improved? What could we do if we had more money? And to make those things actually kind of a roadmap for the school funding cases of the future. Let me stop there because I know there's a lot to cover.
Yes, thank you, Stan. I remember when the decision came in and I was teaching, I told my students that the court in PA has just said that, you've been growing up under this unconstitutional system and that all the funding in our classroom has been declared illegal. And one of my kids was like, oh, we should send the school cops after those legislators. That was a great idea. All right, I want to turn to Eleni. Eleni's got this just brilliant article that I feel like really opened my eyes up to a whole new category of debt that I had not been thinking about, right? So you point out in your article, Eleni, that it is not just individuals that are going into debt to pay for their education, but actually entire school districts are increasingly going into debt on top of this unequal funding system, right? We've got this growing monster of debt. Can you give some examples of what this looks like, why we should be worried about it, and talk about how debt plays a role in exacerbating some of the inequalities we see between school districts that Stan talked about?
Absolutely. So, what's the story that Stan just told us is bad enough on its own. And if it ended there, it would be, as we all know, it's infuriating, maddening, unjust story. What I'm here to tell you is actually it gets worse. That in the context, and I'm sorry about this, folks, if we can have the tomato lobbing session after in the context of underfunded schools, what school districts are forced to do in the wake of insufficient funds is what households in some ways are forced to do in the wake of insufficient income. They take on debt. So to keep the doors open, to keep the gas running and the heat going in schools, school districts have to borrow oftentimes millions of dollars to just maintain the basic building. So, to give you a context of how much this is, in 2019, there was roughly across the country $500 billion worth of school district debt. That same year was an all-time high for federal investment in education, public education, K-12. That was around $750 billion. So for a sense of proportion, schools basically have as much money on their credit cards, for lack of a better analogy, as they do money coming in from the federal government. And that creates a bunch of problems. It's a tool. This is the main idea that I want everybody to get about debt. It's a tool that's offered as a kind of life-saving device to get through insufficient funds, but it creates a lot of perverse problems on its own, and it intensifies existing inequalities. So let me tell you about what I mean. So when a school district borrows money, they have to then pay that money back. And this then comes with interest, it comes with fees, and most of all, it makes the school districts reliant on credit in order to have funds. And as a result, the credit rating operations become sort of a chief priority of a school district. In order to get the cheapest source of money, they have to maintain a good credit rating. But the problem with this is that what was sort of starts as a financial relationship between schools and banks becomes a power relationship. And the schools become reliant on credit, and the credit rating operations begin to dictate a lot of schools' priorities. So in theory, credit ratings are a metric used to get information about how likely a borrower is going to default on a loan, so that whoever's lending the money can know, like, oh, that's a risky loan, that's a not risky loan. In reality, the information that credit rating agencies use, it's kind of like a rubric that you might use with your students in a class. You know, did you do this? Did you do this? Did you do this? And then they get a grade at the end. It's literally an A plus, AA plus. There's not an F, but there's junk, which is like the lowest grade. But the inputs for that, it's not topic sentence. It's not, does this essay have a thesis? It's how much wealth is in this neighborhood? What are the property values of the homes in this neighborhood? The credit rating metrics take factors like, how militant are the labor unions in this district? How many teacher strikes have been in this district? A teacher strike is a very dangerous proposition for a creditor, because a militant teachers union could demand higher wages that could threaten how much money gets paid back to the bank at the end of the loan. So all of this stuff is perfectly legal, and in fact, it's baked into the contract of borrowing money. And what really ends up happening is that existing inequalities get intensified. So, to take the example of property values, we know that there's a whole history of an ongoing present of racist discrimination based on who gets to buy homes in what neighborhoods. That is part and parcel. The lower the property value in a neighborhood, which is a subject of, violent racist discrimination, is going to gives license to a school district to either to have cheaper access to funding or not. So that's one thing. So as the kind of headline point there is how all this ends up working is that school districts that have the least resources need debt, rely on debt in many cases the most, and then get punished at the highest rates. These extraction costs become incredibly high. Every loan, as we all know from our own student loans, credit cards, whatever, has a whole bunch of, it's not free money. We wish it was, but it's not. There's interest, there's fees, and all of that. I'm working on another study right now that shows that school districts that are predominantly Black pay higher costs in fees and other kind of costs from borrowing than predominantly white school districts. So this is a keen part of discrimination. And then the other point about, this is all kind of bad. It's all very bad. But the other, to twist the knife even more, is that it's quite undemocratic how this stuff gets set up. So when a school district, the covenant, the contract that they sign to borrow money, sets one of the main terms of that covenant isn't just how much money and when it's going to get paid. It's the order of operations of how money gets paid back. So school districts have to pledge their creditors, we pay you back this loan on this money before we financed other things. So in many cases, the money to pay back a debt has to be set years in advance before any other budgetary priorities. And as a result, things like school boards or PTAs may go to the table to talk about what's on the budget, but there's a certain amount of money already been set off the table by these bond covenants, the codes of borrowing. So it creates a bind. The conditions of not having enough become punishing on their own, not just because you haven't had enough, but to get locked into this trap to get more money becomes a kind of poisonous, toxic cycle. And as we all know, it's not exactly an exciting, thrilling topic. Most of us, when we think about debt, either don't want to hear about it or we fall asleep. So it makes it all the easier for these systems to be passed off as rational, logical, technically necessary, instead of exactly what they are, which are and as we know, it takes a whole host of people naming what's happening in the truest terms. That's the first step to dismantling these kinds of systems of injustice. So I just want to echo what Jason said earlier. Kudos to all you all for being here. Kudos to Rethinking Schools for shelling out the pages to name this problem. The fact that most of us are unaware of it makes it much more difficult to organize around and to rethink what the alternatives could be.
Yes, and I just want to lift up one of the most shocking stories I read in your piece, Eleni, that I did not know about, that in the summer of 2022, the Biden administration actually sued Rochester, New York for overspending on teacher salaries and not and supposedly misleading bond investors about it, right? Like they were being very clear. Our priority here is not your teacher salaries, it's that you pay back your bond investors.
Right.
And of course, Rochester's predominant, Black school district. So thank you both for that, incredible discussion. I want to turn now. We've hopefully thoroughly depressed you, right? But we want to turn now to some struggle, right? Because obviously the key thing here is that we need to organize against these monsters, the inequality in school funding, the debt, and one recent really successful campaign was in Pennsylvania around a different kind of debt, around school lunch debt. So I'm going to turn to Elizabeth, Lester Abdallah, Nick Marcil, who are going to tell us a little bit about this campaign. I'm really excited to bring them into this conversation. So obviously, another aspect of the way debt shows up in our schools is lunch debt that students incur. And lunch debt for students is actually pretty common, because to qualify for free lunch in public schools, in most places, your family income has to be less than $36,000 a year. So of course, many families don't make this threshold, but then still struggle to pay for school lunches. And this means that there is now $262 million in national public school meal debt. So Elizabeth and Nick, can you talk about the organizing that you did around school lunch debt? How did you start this campaign? What were some of the lessons you learned throughout it? And what was the outcome?
Hi, everyone. Yes, thanks, Adam, for that intro. And the scope of the debt is obviously so large, as Adam said. And so we're organizers, part of the Pennsylvania Cancel Lunch Debt Coalition. We are focused on canceling existing school lunch debt in Pennsylvania and also seeking universal funding for school meals. And this is a movement that is happening in other states and across the country. We've seen in the past 2 years or so, California, Minnesota, Maine, some of these states are passing universal meal funding. And a lot of this is coming out of COVID, when that was covered for 2 years for all students. So we've seen it work, and we've seen it have great effects on education. But now in Pennsylvania and a lot of states, we're going back to accumulating debt because they are no longer free. So we're hoping to do the same here in Pennsylvania. And we've been doing this for over 2 years now. The Debt Collective approached some organizers in the spring, summer of 2021 in Bucks County, which is north of Philadelphia. It's a wealthy county, but a high income inequality within Bucks County. And Debt Collective approached about organizing around this issue. They had some funds that they wanted to use to help build power on this issue, and then hopefully negotiate for pennies on the dollars with the districts to buy back this debt so that we could cancel it. But really the focus was on building a community of local debtors and the community members to build power around this issue, because as so much of their work is focused on different ways of bringing people together and the ways that we do have power then together. So they reached out to different groups. That's why we are a coalition, different groups that had already been doing work, and people came on board. We learned a lot about this issue. We brought in people to explain, like Eleni and other people, to explain about how schools manage debt and how debt is accrued. We used right to know requests, like FOIA requests, to find out from our local school districts what the amount of debt was. And kind of through talking to people and doing that, we decided to focus on a small school district at the pilot kind of district. I think they had about $15,000 to $20,000 in debt. And it was a square mile borough called Bristol Borough, as opposed to their next door neighbor, Bristol Township, had $120,000 in debt. So obviously, some schools have massive debt. The school district I live in Morrisville, Pennsylvania, the grocery store giant had paid for the existing debt, which is great, but it doesn't do anything for a long-term fix. So that's kind of where what we were looking at in Bucks County. So we started with a debtors assembly in a local park, which was an opportunity to bring people together to talk about their debt, their experiences of it, or for teachers and staff to talk about what it was like seeing kids hungry at school, how that affects their learning. So a variety of experiences were shared. And in the article, we touch on some of those and kind of bring in some voices of people that have either experienced it on multiple sides of it. So educators and students looking back at what that was like for them. So that was a great way to be in person. And that was especially important because we were in between COVID waves and it was good to gather in person. But we really did try reaching out to all the teachers in the district, local community groups. It was a lot of work, and Nick will tell you some of our lessons. It was really hard because we weren't really getting a lot of feedback from people. But we did have a great surprise and a great victory. Then in about February, so almost like 9 months into us doing this, we went to a school board meeting to kind of raise the issue in front of the board, but also most importantly for the live stream, just for people to kind of come on board with the coalition. We talked about the amount of debt in Bristol Borough and the just the effects that debt and then hunger has on education and learning. And so we were really pleasantly surprised, though, when the board president said that this was something that they had considered before. It had kind of gotten lost in the shuffle, but that's something that they had talked about. And so then they committed on the spot to canceling the existing lunch debt in the school district. We didn't even have to negotiate with them for buying the debt. That was something that they wanted to do to take care of their students. They operate a food pantry, and this is one of the poorer school districts in our part of the state. And so that was really moving also to see the way that they were taking ownership as like a community of care for their students. So we followed up with them a couple of times, and in the last summer, 2022, before students returned to the year, they sent a letter informing them that the debt had been canceled. And so that was really exciting. And students then did come into a school year for the first time in 2 years without universal meals. So, debt can now just start back up, which is why it's a kind of a two-pronged approach. But it was absolutely a victory. And I'll pass it along to Nick. I hope if he has power to be able to share some lessons. And if not, he wrote some down, so I can give it to you.
Let's see, Nick, you there?
Yeah, hey, can folks hear me? Okay, good,
Go for it.
awesome. Thanks, Adam, and thanks, Elizabeth. So sorry if it's a little choppy, lost power here right as things were starting. So hopefully folks hear me loud and clear. I'm going to try and pick up where Elizabeth left off. But yeah, I mean, to say of some of these lessons learned right with this campaign, one of the, I think, crucial ones is, and, regardless of whether it's lunch debt or student debt or other kinds of debt, the debt is, at times, a different thing and, sometimes a more complex thing to organize around due to the shame, stigma, and sort of limited time that many might have, regarding the debt that they already hold. We see this with school meal debt, and where, there's been a lot of laws over time around like lunch shaming that folks might have heard on in their own particular state. I know that I heard some within Pennsylvania. And, with that, right, that's one way to supposedly solve the problem of stopping, shaming with it. But then, why don't we actually make sure that we, every single student has school meals, right? Just like how we, provide a desk, how we might provide, pencils, anything that, a kid might need to go to school. And similarly with some of the stuff that Stan was talking about and Elaine was talking about, and, both the funding aspects, school meals we know are like crucial to students and yet are not really funded in a way that are, synonymous with that. And, really with some of the organizing that we did, we really, tried to take the time into reaching out to educators, some of which who were able to join into the work that we were doing, some of which understandably within different spheres. But really it's, with this kind of organizing, you need to really take that time, because a lot of folks, might not have the time. And many might not even be directly thinking of some of this debt analysis, kind of as what, Adam, you were stating to Eleni of some of the work that she's done, I think helps to uncover some of these, creatures that we don't, look at every now and again. And in particular with this, school meal debt, there's a lot of instances in where, folks are not talking about this issue. We had some folks who've come into our coalition who have shared kind of their own experiences, some of which, I didn't even know off the bat even had these. And that's why, really cultivating this space and sort of, still continuing on with this campaign to try to get universal school meals throughout Pennsylvania and cancel the existing lunch debt, I think is so crucial into showcasing that. We've even learned, and I've learned it in a couple different instances, but of times where school districts will, waste more money and resources and time to try and collect a debt of, just like a small portion. Maybe it's even something of a couple dollars, rather than just say, you know what, there's no purpose, in going after this. And we know that, both this is something that, the state should be taking on, but also it's, a responsibility federally, is, Elizabeth noted of the importance of over the pandemic and the time that we had of universal school meals, federally. Something else that I don't know if Elizabeth added upon, only because I was sort of coming in and out, was something that I learned about of this community eligibility provision, in where basically, there are some school districts that might qualify for universal school meals under this particular provision, but there's a lot of, bureaucratic paperwork that comes with it, and, resources that a lot of school districts might not have the, ability to take the time to do in order to get that, and we see that not only with school meals, but also with other funding sources that schools will try to, grasp into. But yeah, I hope that that sort of adds some pieces of the puzzle into some of the work that we've been doing, and, that we can continue having this great conversation and, building more power, as Stan, I think, highlighted, of, the importance of both the legal avenue, but then the importance of the, real organizing and bringing folks together around this. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. All right, so I am now going to hand it over to Jason for another crucial conversation about teacher debt.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you to the interpreters too, who are doing a great job here. And I want to start off actually by asking the 67 people that are with us if you could do something really important. And what I'd like to ask you to do, you don't have to, is to put in the chat the amount of student debt that you have. So, for example, I have $230,000 in student loans. And one of the reasons we want to put this in the chat is because, like I said earlier, we want to get rid of the stigma that comes around with student debt. So we got 210,000 parent plus, damn, yeah, that's 30K, 100, 55, 150 for your wife, 0 old, so I've had a lot of years to pay for it, 13,000, more than 100K. You got, see these numbers? This is incredible. This is really devastating. And what we want to talk about is, what does that do to you as a person? What does that do to your family? And what does it do to you as a teacher? Like, how does that impact your teaching? How does that impact the way you think of education? How long you're going to be in this struggle? Next, I want you to do something really important. And just take a hot second to imagine, what would your life be like if we canceled that shit? What would your life be like if we canceled all that student debt? And just add a word in the chat if you want to. Freedom, liberty, happiness. I don't know. You could live. I could work one job. Yeah. Many teachers are working many. Wiggle room, rest, relief. There's a lot of things that come to mind. And we want to keep thinking about, like, all the different things that could happen, the ways our lives could be if we cancel what ultimately is an unjust debt. We need to recognize that the student debt crisis is a result of public policy decisions made in the Reagan years. Universities in the United States used to be pretty much free for public universities. They started to impose tuition after student activism in the 1960s and 70s, and after our universities started to get more inclusive to people that had historically been marginalized. That's when tuition came. That's when funding dropped off the map. And that's when teachers went into massive debt beginning in those years. The last thing I want to do to start this off is to say that the reason I got into this fight is because of a teacher. And this was a teacher that taught for 30 years on Chicago's Southwest Side, gave his whole life to education, made teacher wages, which we all know isn't much, had a family, was a great father. And one day he got sick, cancer. So he ends up in a hospital. You got 1 week to live, they tell him. And if you live longer than a week, you got to leave because your medical insurance doesn't cover you. So with this family by his side, he outlives that 1 week. Goes into week 2, they kick him out of hospital 1, he ends up in hospital 2, they tell him the same thing. We can hold you here for 5 days, your medical insurance doesn't cover you. All the while going into debt. But like all teachers that we know, this guy never gave up. So he keeps living. And as he's living, he tells his son, one of these days I'm going to have to go because I can't keep living and piling up debts as the days go on. Passes away, and I was there with him for his last breath. And the last thing he told me was that he was worried about what was going to happen to us as kids. And sure enough, we lost the house. Bill collectors came, took everything we own. And so I just want to add that he might not be breathing anymore, but I still am. And as long as I have breath, I'm coming after the systems that created this fucked up system to make him and any other people go through that. K-12 teachers have massive debts in this country. According to NEA, nearly half of all educators took out student loans to pay for college, and they still owe $58,700 on average. Among them, 1 in 7 of teachers still owes more than $105,000. We learned from that same NEA report that, quote, Black educators have significantly more student debt than white educators. $68,000 compared to $54,000 on average. And one of the reasons of this is because of generational wealth. So we need to ask the question, who owes who what here? Student debt is also an overlooked barrier to increasing teacher diversity. Studies show that there's less diversity in teaching because folks don't want to go into debt, and the retention is a problem too because folks can't stay in the field because of the debts they owe and the salaries are so low. Women is a gender issue as well, account for nearly 75% of the K-12 teacher workforce. And they owe 66% of the 1.8 trillion in student loans that this country burdens us with. So 2/3 of all the student loan debt is held by women. That's a control mechanism, not just an economic problem. So with all these numbers in mind, what do? Well, one of the first things we do is we start talking about this stuff in public. We talk to it with our friends, we talk to it with our loved ones, and we say, we don't owe them anything, they owe us. But the power of testimony is what we want to focus on here. And so to do that, I want to turn to my colleagues who I've had great joy getting to know, listen to, learn from over the years. Rochelle Brooks, who's in California, Brian Gallagher, who's in Philadelphia. And they're just two of the many teachers that I've had the great fortune to talk with about the K-12 student debt crisis. And so with that in mind, I would like to hear Rochelle and Brian answer 2 questions. One is, first, what's it like to be a teacher in debt? And second, what's it like to be involved in debt resistance? And why is debt resistance important for other teachers to be a part of? So Rochelle, please.
Hey everyone, it's a pleasure to be here with you all today, tonight. Yeah, I'm a first generation college graduate. I come from a single mom household. You know, my mom did the best that she could, had no understanding of college. So when I got to college, I remember the first thing we did was we went to the financial aid office and they asked me what I wanted to do for a living. It was within the field of public service. So they said, okay, great, you can take out loans and they will all be forgiven. Don't worry about it. And that's exactly what I did. I went to school. I ended up having 2 kids, you know, found myself in difficult times, faced some houselessness, got in some legal trouble, and had to literally finance my survival, me and my kids' survival. And in retrospect, you know, I think of all of the things that I did, all the steps that I took, and I did everything right. And there were still so many things that went wrong. And there's still so many things that are going wrong, because I decided to go to school, because I decided to become an educator. And being an educator is one of the most important roles in our society. In globally, it's one of the most important things that you can do. And we're being penalized not only for going to school, but we're being penalized for serving our communities. It's putting us at an economic disadvantage, right? We're going into our communities, we're going to school, we're serving, in my case, I work at a Title I school in South Central LA. We're serving the most vulnerable population of folks that are in need, and it's threatening our survival, quite literally. You know, I could have gone to school, been a lawyer, been an engineer, still had massive amounts of debt, but getting paid a lot more. And that's not what society should be. Teachers should be revered. It's a career, it's a role in society that is irreplaceable. And it makes it very difficult to want to be a teacher. It makes it difficult to stay committed because we simply can't survive. I work 2 to 3 jobs as well. And I think about my own kids, and I think about how much time I'm spending away from them, how it's shaping my entire life. I'm worse off financially now because I decided to go into education. I have $250,000 of student loan debt. And I think of what my life would be had I, one, had chose a different career or not gone to school at all, right? And that's not what it should be. And when I think about debt resistance and how important it is, as it's been said in this space, it's very important that we're telling our stories. There's a lot of stigma and a lot of shame that comes with the idea of holding debt, but it's not the result of a personal failure. I should be able to go to school. I should be able to become a teacher without debt. I should not have to finance an education. I should not have to finance my survival. It's a systemic failure that's not allotted to me. It's a systemic failure that's not allotted to every teacher in this country. And the more that we tell our stories, the more that we come together, we can leverage our collective power. We really do have the power against folks that created the system and that uphold the system. We outnumber them. We've got to now out-organize them, right? So telling our stories, using our collective power. One of the things that we're doing at the Debt Collective, we're organizing a debt strike. If you haven't heard about it, a debt strike is, you know, you don't pay. That is a form of resistance. Anytime that you have the ability to use your collective power to strike, you do it. And that's what we're doing. We're literally saying we can't pay, so we won't pay. And if you're not already tapped in with the Debt Collective to join the debt strike, please just go to debtcollective.org to get more information about that debt strike. And yeah, exactly. We outnumber them. Now we've got to out-organize them.
Thank you, Rochelle. Brian, please.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks for inviting me here. Rochelle, I appreciate that word penalized. I had thinking of what it's like to be a teacher in debt. I feel really trapped. I feel deceived by, my parents, by all the teachers I had growing up that told me just go to school and, you can have a better life. And then becoming a teacher, part of the reason I'm in this, my master's program right now is because to keep my certification, I have to get continuing ed, which isn't a bad thing in and of itself, but the idea that I already am making wages that make it hard to live a good whole life. Now I have to take on even more debt just to keep my certification. So, this idea that, why don't people want to become a teacher? Why do we have this teaching shortage? To Rochelle's point as well, it absolutely affects our ability to stay in this job. About a year ago, we bought a house, my wife and I, and in that process, as two people that have worked full time since we were 17, I went to community college, Philadelphia, Temple, worked my way full time through it all. I've never had more than $5,000 in the bank account in my entire life. Most of the time it's been paycheck to paycheck. When we tried to buy a house as two full-time employed people, she works at Temple University with, relatively good paying jobs with, benefits and all these things. We had to get a co-signer and go through all these extra hoops because our debt to income ratio was so insane that when they calculated our monthly payments, we didn't really approve for any sort of mortgage. Luckily, have some in-laws that were able to help us out, so we were able to make it happen. But when I think about how many people don't have those sorts of resources and people to rely on, we have an entire generation of people that can't, move up the ladder, so to speak. As a teacher, I think about how I talk to students about college. I would never go out there and tell my students, don't go to college, but I tell them to seriously think about it. Are you going to school just because it's the, quote unquote next step? Or is it because that degree is actually going to help you with a specific goal you have in mind? And I kind of say, if you're not sure, is it worth taking on that debt for something that you don't know if you're actually going to use that degree for? I encourage things like going into community college where you can get, decent credits, especially if you're not sure what you want to do. So to just find the cheaper ways, apply for all the scholarships and grants. But I do, I have to have that honest conversation with them that frankly, a lot of the adults in my life did not have with me as I was growing up. Which kind of, leads to that idea of like, what do we actually do with this? Why is it important for us to resist that? I think of, especially working in an urban school district, schools are a place where a lot of, arguably all of societies, a profoundly sick society, all of our problems sort of come to a head, right? If our students don't have housing or healthcare, that manifests in our classrooms. So when I think about how debt affects our lives, like we are in every neighborhood, we communicate with members, we talk to family members, and I think of all sort of like hard times as opportunities to organize. We're in every neighborhood, we can have these conversations, we can agitate the idea of sharing our stories, having conversations, education is sort of how you can sort of build that critical mass down the line where we can actually overcome some of these things. We have debt. We're talking to young people that may be accruing their own debt in the future. It's really important for us to kind of take a stand and have these difficult but honest conversations with ourselves, with our peers, with our students, with our communities.
Thank you, Brian. And so I just want to cap this off by saying there's two things that could happen if there was the power behind it to make it happen. The first, Joe Biden has the authority to cancel all student loan debt with the swipe of a pen. It's in the Higher Education Act of 1965. Whether or not he uses that is up to him, and whether or not there's a movement to make him use the pen that he has. That might be or probably would be challenged at the Supreme Court. But again, what matters is what's the force that we have in order to make sure that these things go through and stay through. The other side of this is that you would have to also make public universities free again. And there's plenty of proposals for that. The Sanders campaign had one during the called College for All, would have paid for every single student in the United States to go to a public four-year college for free, plus stipends for the poor students. The money when it came from transactions on Wall Street taxes. And so the gotcha question is always for these two things, where are you going to get the money for that? And one way you can respond to that is ask those folks, where do we get the money for the forever war? Where do we get the money for the prison industrial complex? Where do we get the money for all these other things like tax cuts for the wealthiest people in this country? We can do this, but it takes collective organizing, as Rochelle said. I encourage all of you to consider joining Debt Collective at debtcollective.org. And again, join up with this educator caucus. We'll keep the conversation about what it would take to get debt liberation, especially foremost for educators across this country. So thank you very much. We turn this back over to Adam and Sierra.
Thank you so much, Jason, Brian, Rochelle, for sharing your stories, sharing your testimonies, and being vulnerable with us, using those stories really as a way to fuel collective power and collective action. We appreciate you. And so now I am excited to be in conversation for our last round of conversation with Young and Frida, really in looking to the classroom and talking about how to and how not to teach about debt and inequality in the classroom. And so Young, your piece is just a deep dive into teaching financial literacy, something that is a growing trend in high school. We hear it all the time, especially in economics courses. So can you talk about what some of the typical financial literacy curriculum looks like, why it's problematic, and give us a bit of a sense of what you do in the classroom instead?
Yeah, the typical curriculum is not that different from what used to be in economics courses, and especially what they used to call personal finance. But I think it's been rebranded and kind of updated now, and it's being pushed in more and more states. And in fact, in my state, they not only made these standards a requirement, but they actually tried to pass a law to make a standalone class for credit a requirement for high school graduation. And what's in these courses and standards are typical things that were in them before, like things like doing your taxes and figuring out your budget and things like that. And now and also investing in stock markets. But now they've added an increased emphasis on careers and job readiness and debt and understanding, especially college debt. And I think that has come about in the way that No Child Left Behind has kind of changed from NCLB to especially with all the resistance against standardized testing to, rebrand it as Every Student Succeeds Act and this focus on college and career readiness. And so one of the things that I do that counters some of that. So for instance, there's so much on, especially in this new version, focusing on careers. And one of the first things that I do is, two things. One is looking at the Bureau of Labor Statistics data on the existing jobs now and the projected jobs that will exist 20 years into the future. And what students see is that there's a structural problem. It is impossible for every student to succeed because the majority of jobs now and into the future will be low-paying jobs that are not living wage jobs. And it's just the majority. And if every student were trained and educated somehow to be into the STEM fields or whatever, the majority would be unemployed and doing some low-paid job. And I really try to emphasize to my student that every single job has value and all work and workers should have dignity and living wages. And the problem isn't that some people are going to be doing those jobs. The problem is that people doing those jobs will be underpaid, disempowered, and disrespected. And that's what needs to change. And so with that, I definitely draw from the Zinn Education Project, some of the curriculum that Bill Bigelow wrote with Norm Diamond on Power in Our Hands, that looks at what rights that workers have or don't have, and also do some comparisons with other countries. So for instance, it's default in the United States that workers are employed at will, and they can be fired for no reason or any reason. And there are only a few protected cases where workers cannot be fired. Whereas if you're in a union, one of the most important things that every union has is the just cause provision, which is standard whether you're in a union or not in Europe. And so really, rather than this kind of individual kind of training to be successful in this rigged system, what we need are the kind of political understandings and political movements that will make these policy changes as well. And another thing that I teach, that I use, it's published in The Intercept, is this great conversation by the Debt Collective, where what Jason was talking about earlier, they talk about how college used to be free, and it was Reagan that made this decision to take away funding for free public college for political reasons rather than economic reasons. And so those kind of teachings, I think, are really important to counter this kind of idea that somehow individual students are going to be responsible for their own navigating into in this precarious economic world that has grown more and more unequal. And then, other things like instead of just doing your taxes, we look at tax policies and compare them over time. And we see how, we used to have many more brackets for taxes, and that we used to tax the rich at 94%. And it's been decades since that we've cut those kind of taxes. And so there are reasons that we're no longer able to fund higher education or K through 12 education as we've done at times, and that we're more and more trying to help individuals navigate through this kind of precarity that is structured in, that can only be changed through social movements and through politics.
Wow, thank you so much, Young. That's so powerful. And I appreciate you problematizing financial literacy and how it really lifts up individualism rather than collective power, and also the disruption and the dismantling of the long-term systems and how those ultimately show up in our systems and structures of debt. So I appreciate you sharing those tangible strategies. Yeah.
I should just mention one other thing that I mentioned in the article too, is the conflict of interest, that most of this curriculum is written by Wall Street banks and also Wall Street financial institutions like Intuit. I didn't realize this until just recently because I largely wrote my piece last summer, but I just realized found that in November of 2022, Intuit did a pilot program at a local charter school here in Portland. And I didn't realize, I knew about Intuit being responsible for selling TurboTax and being in trouble for basically selling this tax software that really should have been free, and they got sued for it. But they also are creators of Credit Karma and QuickBooks. So a lot of this curriculum basically trains people to use the services that these corporations sell and profit off of, and really kind of swindle people with as well.
Wow. It's just so insidious. It runs so, so deep. Wow. Well, Frida, I'd love to turn it over to you to talk about the teaching that you've done around debt and what other teachers might be able to implement from your curriculum. I appreciated your piece so much. Everything from the pictures of your classroom and having to move classrooms and having conversations with students about why the building is crumbling, and then actually creating the curriculum to have those critical conversations. So tell us a little bit more, and thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I guess the first thing is that I myself, I was a public school student in the Philadelphia public schools and then became a teacher. And I didn't even know that school districts could be in debt until I was in grad school. So it just goes to show that nobody knows that this is happening, or at least I didn't know it was happening, and nobody I knew that it was happening. And I think in Philadelphia anyway, a common frustration is that when you try and call out the school district and say like, hey, there's asbestos everywhere and there's lead poisoning in these buildings, why are you not fixing them? They always say, well, we don't have any money, which is true. They don't have any money, but the little money they do have, they're spending a ton of it on repaying this debt. And so having that knowledge to respond to the school district with and say, actually, you have more money than you're saying, is a tool that then students and teachers and citizens can use to hold the district accountable. Because yes, there's these higher powers, the state, the feds, the city, that should be doing, their share and paying districts what they need. But for us to really be able to, at the micro level, hold the district accountable, people have to have that knowledge. So that's sort of what motivated me to want to teach about it in the first place. And then in terms of like what was effective for me as a concept that a district could be in debt, it's just complex. It was complex for me to even really wrap my head around, like, okay, well, who is it, like the superintendent, like who is taking out the debt? I don't understand how it works. So then I knew, okay, the kids are going to be confused too. So for me, the best thing to do was first to figure out, what do kids know about debt generally? Like, what do they know about credit scores generally? And for me, I was lucky because my kids, unlucky, that my kids actually knew a lot about debt and credit scores already, because a lot of them are renters. You have to have a certain credit score to rent a lot of places. A bunch of them had experiences being denied renting different places. So we had some knowledge, like background knowledge to kind of work on there. And then I ended up actually making and it's in my article, linked in my article. I ended up making like a choose your own debt adventure game, where kids could start with like a personal story and try and make different choices where they encounter, the one is like a medical debt story. So they have to decide whether or not to take out a loan. And then as it goes on, you kind of see that the whole thing is a catch-22. There are some decisions that are slightly better than others, but all of the endings are a ripoff. And then you move on and you switch to playing as a school district in a similar situation. And all of the decisions that you can make end up badly, but again, some of them end up worse. So if you choose to take on debt and then rob your students of all of the money that they need in order to have safe schools, then you end up having to do austerity measures and you end up having to fire teachers, not have enough nurses. A kid dies in the story, which happened in 2013 when they cut nurses from schools on a day that there wasn't a nurse in the building. A kid had an asthma attack and passed away. So and the kids too, like when they're doing it, they're like, oh, this is overblown. And then you can turn around and say, it's not overblown. It literally happened. So I think that starting at the micro scale of like what they already understand about debt and having them sort of role play, and then you can upscale it. That really helped me the most.
Thank you so much. Yes, I really appreciated learning more about your choose your own debt adventure game and just bringing those scenarios to light and then being able to engage in those critical conversations and dialogue about why this is happening, and then also the resistance, what we can do about it. And so, wow, this whole webinar conversation was just full of richness, tangible tools, resources, storytelling, history, policy. And I'm just so appreciative. There's so much that I just want to sit with. And so for everyone that is listening in to this webinar, we definitely invite you to grab a copy of the special summer issue on resisting debt and funding justice to learn even more about what the panelists have highlighted today. Some of the things that I'm leaving with is that Jason wrote this in the chat, that debt is a form of extraction. but there is power in our individual and collective stories, and also in our collective organizing. As Rochelle said, we have the power, we outnumber them, we just have to out-organize them. So let's do it. And we can also teach this and create space for students to engage in dialogue, to assess and analyze the current state of their schools and their districts, and then also to create space for resisting debt. Again, everyone on the call, you all have access to our $18 magazine subscription promo with the code resist debt. Thank you to the co-moderators, to Jason, to Adam, to all of the panelists for sharing your stories, for lifting up your curriculum, for analyzing policy with us. And thank you to Crystal and Tiara, our ASL interpreters this evening. Thank you to the Rethinking Schools editors and staff for all of the work behind the scenes to make this magazine possible. And then thank you so much to the Debt Collective for this partnership. We look forward to continued conversation and all the work that you'll do with educators and caucusing. Let's organize, let's get this collective power going, and let's abolish debt. Thank you all so much.